In this video, I'm going to be building this quirky Schwimmwagen Trippel SG 638 by Werk in 1/35 scale. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. This is a fairly recent release from Werk and it looks pretty bonkers, so of course I wanted to build it. Let's take a look at what we get inside the kit. The upper hull tub is moulded in one piece using slide moulding technology and it looks pretty nice. There are two A-sprues, which have the wheel hubs, the chairs and some other small accessories. In no particular order, sprue D has lots of small items for the interior, the exterior, and the nicely moulded all-weather canopy. There's a very small amount of flash to clean up, but that won't be a problem. Sprue C has the nicely moulded wooden duckboards, the lower hull, and components that make up the interior. The clear parts are really crisp and highly transparent. They look really good. One part of the windscreen is slightly warped, but this shouldn't be a problem. A source of contention for some modelers, this kit does come with rubber tyres. My rubber tyres had some defects in the moulding, only lightly on the sidewalls. The Trippel also comes with a small photo etch fret for the window wipers. And the decals are unbranded, so I presume they're printed in-house by Werk. They do look pretty crisp and in register. And the instructions in usual Werk style are really nice. They're clear and easy to follow with a sprue map. The build is broken down into nice steps, and it's really easy to follow. There are several paint schemes you can choose from for this build. There is a winter whitewash example, two Panzer Grey examples, a geometric Panzer Grey and sand example, and the example I'm going to do, sand or Dunkelgelb mottles over a Panzer Grey base. Although the colour profile shows Panzer Grey over sand, but I do believe it was the other way round. And that's everything you get in the box, so let's get on with the build. As usual, the parts were removed from their sprues with my god hand sprue cutters. I really like my single edge sprue cutters. They cut cleanly and crisply close to the part, meaning usually there's not a lot to clean up afterwards. The first step I tackled was the wheels. The main hub is placed inside the rubber tyre. A separate insert is then glued into the back. I was really careful not to use too much glue so I could remove the rubber tyres later. I didn't want to have to mask off the wheel hubs. And if you're careful, this technique does work. The next step was to build up the four corners of the suspension. These sub-assemblies are really quite complex and comprise around 10 parts per corner. For the most part, these are fairly simple to assemble, but there are some slightly tricky sections that may require more care. Because each corner of suspension was independently constructed, I was slightly worried about wheel alignment. But luckily the centre axles have quite a positive fit, so I think in the end this will be okay. The trickiest part of the assembly was the spring and the spring guard. This took a little bit of jiggling to get into position, and I recommend you do this whilst the glue is still wet, so you've got time to manoeuvre the parts. The front assemblies are finished off with a small control arm, before each independent suspension unit was glued onto the lower hull tub. The fit was pretty good, but there are a few gaps here you could fill if you wanted. I mean, I'm on the side of nobody's really going to see it, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. Before we could move further, I had to glue in the prop shaft. Now, being the eternal child that I am, I decided to make this movable because moving parts are great. And it moved on the real thing, so I drilled in some brass wire to the rear of the prop shaft assembly and drilled a hole in a chunk of sprue and then popped this into place with a tiny drop of super glue. And hey presto, moving parts. I really like the duck boards on the floor of the driving compartment, and it was this step in the assembly that you had to glue them in place. But to make it easier to paint them, I left them unglued for now. The transmission and drive shaft housings were then glued in place between the two sets of duck boards. This is quite a nicely detailed little unit. And it's always really cool on some of these old vehicles when you see some of the mechanical components poking through. The knobs and levers were then glued in place on top of the transmission housing. To my eyes, these look a little clunky, but I don't know what the real ones look like, so they may be good. Next up, the driver compartment floor was glued onto the lower hull tub. This was pushed carefully into place, and some of my VMS extra thin fast setting glue was run around the edges to make sure there was a strong bond. Next up, the rear firewall was glued in place. A quick word of caution here. These parts don't fit quite right, and the instructions aren't very clear as to how they go together. If you assemble the parts as they fit, with the rear seat bed pushing up against the rear firewall, you're going to have a bad time. For a good fit, the firewall should sit on top of the seat bed arches, instead of behind, where I glued it. I highlighted on screen where it should fit as opposed to where I got it to fit, and I did end up having to prise the parts apart a few steps down the line. So make sure to dry fit everything, and just take care when assembling these parts. Next up, the front panel and console was assembled. Again, the fit here was pretty nice, and the detailing on the instrument panel was nice and pronounced. That'll make it easier to paint down the road. I wouldn't recommend gluing this assembly to the floor of the hull tub just yet. In its current state, it's going to be much easier to paint. So once you've assembled the front panel and the two side panels, I'd just set them aside for now. And that's this second sub-assembly complete. It builds up as a cool little unit. So now it's time for the next part of the video, painting the interior. First up, the entire interior was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey. This was thinned at around 40% Mr. Surfacer and 60% Mr. Leveling Thinner. Nice and thin for a nice smooth application. The first colour to go down on the interior proper was AK Real Colour Panzer Grey, or Dunkelgrau. This was cut with some MRP RAF Medium Grey. To bring it more into the fantasy blue zone, I wanted to go for a lighter Panzer Grey this time, as I usually go for a darker one, and variety is the spice of life. And after a few light coats of paint, the interior had its base colour. I mixed in some more MRP RAF Medium Grey to my Panzer Grey mix, and used this to add some artificial highlights to the interior to add some visual interest. This was carefully freehanded with my 0.15 harder in Steenbeck. Using a low pressure and staying close to the model, it didn't take me long to build up some nice highlights. The duckboards were based with my favourite MRP Pale Wood. This shade works really well when you put oils over the top of it, so you can guess where this is going. But first I added some variation to the different planks using some various Vallejo wood colours. I used Vallejo Old Wood, German Camouflage Beige, and probably a few others, but I can't remember exactly what I used. And when those various colours were added, it was time to add some oil paints. To make a change from my usual oil mixes, I decided to use Abteilung 502 Industrial Earth and MIG Streaking Brusher Grime. Perfect balance of warm and cool tones to add some variety to the wood grain. This was brushed on roughly and lightly all over the duckboards. I used my favourite old tatty brush for this. Once the oils had dried for a bit, I brushed off the excess with my tatty brush, leaving a streaky impression of wood grain behind. Patience is key with this technique, and sometimes you'll need to work and rework it until you're happy. So just take your time, but being oils, you've got plenty of working time. So all's good. I'm pretty happy with how these colours turned out. I think I'll use this combo again in future. The floor duckboards were glued in place with some VMS superglue. As everything was already painted, I didn't trust the bond from a styrene cement. So a few dots of superglue in the holes was enough to keep these duckboards in place. The tolerances are quite tight, so you need to be careful here. I did end up scratching some of the seat rests, so I had to touch these up very carefully with my airbrush. Just take care and that shouldn't happen to you. Next up, it was time to paint the seats, and I wanted to do these a little differently. Most examples of this vehicle I've seen have got red leather seats, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted some textured cloth seats. First up, I based the seats with AK 3rd Gen Field Grey Base Green Shade. This was built up with a few light coats. Next up, I added some grey-green to the mix. I used a sable brush that I intentionally splayed, and with an almost dry brushing technique, I used the splayed edges of the brush to add some streaks to add texture to the seats. This was done with down and across motions only. to kind of simulate woven fabric. It doesn't have to be perfect, I just wanted to add some more visual interest to this area. Once I'd worked it enough and I was happy, it was time to add some shadows. I built up a few glazes of AK 3rd Gen Extra Dark Green. These were heavily thinned and built up gradually over time. Because I wanted the glazes to only sit in specific areas, I had to carefully blend the edges out with a damp brush, just so that there weren't any tide marks. And once the seats were done and I was happy with them, and I think they look pretty good, they were carefully put into place. Now it's time to turn our attention to the instrument panel. First up, the dial surrounds were painted with Vallejo white. I'm using the white as a base for a metallic colour so it pops more. Here I'm using my Rosemary & Co. 20 Kolinsky Sable. This brush is fairly new, so the point is still really good. The dial surrounds were then painted with Dark Star Pewter. Again very carefully. And then, not shown here, the centres of the dials were painted in black. To prepare the instrument panel for the decals, I dropped in a small drop of VMS decal set and fix into every aperture. The decals were then carefully slid into place, although I had to make several minor adjustments as they didn't want to sink into the holes. I probably used too much decal setter. To make the interior look a little more lively, I raided my spares box and found some placard decals. These were placed randomly around the cockpit, just to add some visual interest. I then cleaned up any excess decal solution and then used some Alclad Aquagloss to add a glass sheen to the dials. Now it's time to add some weathering to the interior. I started this by picking out the shadows with a mix of Abteilung 502 Starship Filth and black. I mixed this with VMS oil thinner to make up a wash, and ran the dark mixture in and around all the details on the floor. Because Panzer Grey is quite dark, I needed quite a high contrast colour, just to make sure the details popped. Using the same mix, I speckled on some stains to the seats, again just for some more visual interest. Being an amphibious vehicle on the Eastern Front, I figured the interior might get a bit muddy, so I used some AK Brown Earth dust and dirt deposits to add some dirt deposits to the floor and the sidewalls. That was a mouthful. This was brushed carefully into place quite tactically with a fine brush. These dust and dirt deposits can be quite tricky to remove, so it's best to build the effect up slowly. It's much easier to add than it is to take away. While the dust and dirt deposits were still slightly wet, I blended the effect in with a fine brush. Again, this time I used a fine brush for control. My big, soft, stipply blender brush wouldn't do very well in such a confined space. The effect was carried over to anywhere that might accumulate dirt. Not only does collected earth and dirt add a bit of realism, it also adds some nice visual interest. The dust and dirt deposit mix was also painted on the sides of the upper insert section, as these areas would come in contact with the floor. With the interior paintwork done, it's time to finish up the rest of the build. The centre console and sidewall insert was glued onto the lower hull. Everything here seemed to line up nicely. But somewhere along the way, I must have made an error, because when it came to fixing the upper hull half into place, I stumbled across a bit of a fit issue. This was dry fitted several times before I glued it in place, and I couldn't figure out where I was going wrong. So in the end I had to brute force the assembly with tape. I run the glue along all of the seams and then pushed the upper hull into place as best as I could. I then used a rather excessive amount of tape to fix it into place. I should have really clamped this with a G-clamp, but sadly that's a tool I don't yet have in my arsenal. So tape it was, and I used quite a lot of it. As you can see here, it's pretty plastered. As long as the footholes were lined up, I was happy, because I could just fill in any gaps that were left behind. Which, evidently, I had to do, as the gaps here are pretty bad. I really hope that the mistake was mine and not that of the kit. Anyway, the gaps were filled with sprue goo, and I had to use a fair amount. I should have really used a slice of styrene sheet, but I didn't have one the correct width. So sprue goo it was. It took several applications to build up enough to fill in the gap. But because I used quite a lot of sprue goo, it did sink, so I did have to refill it several times. After a day or two when the sprue goo had dried, I sanded away the excess and tried to make it smooth. But again, I did need several applications. There are two wheel arch guards. These are supplied as plastic parts, but I did manage to knock them off, so I replaced them with brass wire. I did have to manhandle the kit quite a bit to sand off the excess sprue goo. Any smaller seams were filled with Mr. Surfacer 1500, like these ones around the front bumper. Let's continue with some of the small parts on this build. The door hinges are supplied as separate parts. I was slightly worried about the fit of the hinges. I thought that I might have to do some filling to tidy them up, but luckily they fit really nicely. The rear guardrail was also fitted at this time. When it came to the all-weather cover or tarp, you had to glue in place a few parts of the folding mechanism. Where the parts fit was actually quite vague, but once I figured it out, they went on okay. The small mechanical plastic parts fit into small divots on the tarp. After some careful inspection and dry fitting, I managed to get them lined up nicely. Because the fit is vague, you may need to do some dry fitting before you commit to final assembly. Some other exterior details were then added, like the two number plates. There were no positive fit locators for these parts, so they just had to be glued carefully into place. I thought a tab system might be better to make sure the fit was more accurate. Then it was time to mask up the clear parts. I cut out some strips from 0.5mm masking tape and placed these around the edges of the windows. Once these were in place and I was happy with their placement, the inner sections were filled in with VMS liquid mask. As I said earlier, the transparencies look really nice, but I did find a very bizarre flaw. For some reason the plastic did not like adhesive, as in the adhesive on tape or the masking fluid. Whichever brand I used left a residue behind that had almost soaked into the plastic parts. I thought that was really bizarre, and it did cause a small problem later. The windscreen was assembled and then placed on the model to dry properly. It wasn't glued in place here, it's just put in place to make sure the side windows dry at the right angle. And that pretty much wraps up the build section, so let's get on with the painting. Or maybe after a false start we'll get on with the painting. The entire model was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey, finned about 60-40 like before. This was sprayed in multiple wet coats to promote coverage. And it's here I noticed my seam had reared its ugly head again, so it needed some more sanding. I think if this seam hadn't bogged the build down, I probably would have finished the build in a week. And it did end up taking 2, which still isn't a long time. Anyway, the entire model was sprayed with my Panzer Grey mix, AK Real Colour Dunkelgrau with MRP RAF Medium Grey. I'd say it was about 20% RAF Medium Grey to 80% Dunkelgrau. As I stated before, I wanted to go for a lighter panzer grey, just for variety. Again, the seam showed up, so I had to do some more sanding. I was a bit more aggressive this time, taking the seam down to bare plastic again, but this time brushing on some thick Mr. Surfacer to try and eliminate that gap once and for all. After brushing on and smoothing out the Mr. Surfacer, I sprayed over an extra layer to blend it in with the rest of the finish. Any overspray and excess paint was smoothed with a fine sanding sponge. And this time all was okay. Let's add some light shading to this amphibious vehicle. I mixed some black in with some panzer grey and thinned it heavily, around 70% thinner. This made it highly translucent, which made sure that the effect was subtle. This was sprayed around all the details, and in any areas where I wanted shadow. The only black I had to hand was Tamiya Semi-Gloss Black. So it does have a slight sheen to it, but that doesn't matter because it will get covered and varnished later. I don't use post shading a lot, but I am starting to see how useful it can be, and it is quite fun to do. Usually I build the shadow up with a black basing technique, but because a lot of this grey is going to be hidden, I didn't think it was worth the time. Because most of the grey was going to get covered up, it didn't matter if I overcooked the effect, but I did keep it subtle. I then added some more RAF medium grey to my panzer grey mix, making a lighter grey, and started to add a few subtle highlights. This was sprayed around some edges and any prominent areas, and also any areas that might catch the sun or the light. Because I didn't want this to be too stark, I built it up in light mottled layers. I quite enjoyed doing the front section. I basically added some light mottled squiggles, moving the airbrush vertically and wiggling it to make sure there was variation. And of course, random light and shadow effects were carried around the rest of the vehicle. We want to keep that interest visible from all angles. Before I could move on to the next step, I noticed a very annoying greasy fingerprint on the bonnet. I used some warm water and a cotton bud to get rid of it because for the next step, you don't want fingerprints. And that leads me to the next step. What is it? Well, I'm going to be using chipping fluid to distress the oversprayed camouflage. And any chipping fluid, whatever you use, doesn't like fingerprints. Anyway, I used VMS Chipping Medium 3K and sprayed over a few misty layers, making sure to build up an even coverage. Next up, I built up some cloudy mottles of Dunkelgelb. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this Dunkelgelb is. I know it came out of an MRP bottle, but it didn't smell like MRP, and I think it was a mix from a previous project. Either way, it was the perfect colour. This step was one of my favourites. I was really looking forward to replicating that cloudy yellow camouflage. Again, I'm spraying this with my 0.15 Harder & Steenbeck. It's being sprayed at around 15 psi, and if you look closely you can see I'm staying very close to the surface. About a centimetre. I didn't want to spray too closely because the mottles would be too tight, and I wanted this to look loose and hand applied. So I wasn't too prissy about the patterns and how I applied it. As long as there was a consistency in the spray pattern, I was happy. You can see here even the centre sections are built up with a loose mottle. I wanted to maintain some visual interest to the cloudy shapes, whilst also making it look slightly hand applied. Already this paint scheme is starting to look pretty striking. The reason I'm using chipping fluid is because I wanted the yellow camo to look like it had been field applied. And in my opinion, a field applied camo wouldn't be as durable as a factory applied one, so it would be more likely to wear away. I've also seen some pictures of some Luftwaffe aircraft where the sprayed on camouflage has worn away in interesting patterns. You'd have some cloudy edges, and then where areas of contact were, you'd have rough edges, and I kinda wanted to replicate that. So with some warm water and a tatty old brush, I got to chipping my model. Because I'm chipping lacquers and not acrylics, it takes a little longer for the chipping fluid to activate. But that doesn't matter, it means we have more control over the process. Here you can see some of those cloudy edges starting to break up, adding a lot more irregularity to the finish. As time goes on and the water starts to activate the chipping fluid, chips in the centre of the camo blobs start to appear. I focused extreme wear on areas that would get the most traffic, like the sides of the vehicle near the door. Also around the fenders and any area that may come into contact with the ground, as well as access hatches and the like. You can use different tools to add different effects to your chipped finish. Sometimes a stiff brush tapped onto the surface can add some really fine irregular chips, and toothpicks can be used to make scratches. Like these ones here. And it looks like we're well on our way to a nice irregular paint finish. These filler caps on the box art showed quite a lot of wear, so I wanted to replicate that. So I paid special attention to around these areas. And of course the effect was carried around the entire model. I think it's looking quite snazzy. Now because I chipped the entirety of the vehicle, I wanted to reinstate some of those soft edges. I don't think every edge would be as worn as it is now. So let's blend some of those back in with the same Dunkelgelb mix and my airbrush. I picked out a few select low traffic areas and softened out some of the edges. Hopefully this will make the camouflage in its wear patterns look more organic and interesting. And that's that done. Let's seal it in with a layer of VMS satin varnish. This will help to unify the sheen of all the different paints I've used. It will also help to protect the chipping fluid from being reactivated during later steps. Although any oil-based products won't reactivate the chipping fluid, water will, and you need water to do the decals and the details. As usual, the areas that are going to be decaled were treated with VMS Decal Set and Fix. The decals are being applied straight onto paint, no gloss. Well, there is a satin, but you know what I mean. The decals went down pretty nicely. There weren't a lot of them, but the carrier film was thin and the printing was crisp. I thought the tactical markings on the back were a little large, but it's all I had, so I ran with it. Once dried, the decals were sealed in with another layer of satin varnish. Next up, let's paint the canopy. First off, for some contrast, I used Vallejo Russian Uniform World War II, a slightly different green to before, and this was brushed all over. I then mixed in some AK 3rd Gen green grey and a random Vallejo sand colour, just for the highlights. And these highlights were again built up in a textural way. I used a crosshatch method to build up the highlights. I'm hoping this will add some more interest and texture. And it seems to be doing the trick. I might start experimenting with more textural applications of paint in future. I might see if I can build up an interesting texture with some sponges. The only downside to adding another element to painting is the potential ingress of dust, which is already a nightmare at my place. Enough jibber jabber, let's move on. The rear duct boards, quite an attractive part of this model, were glued in place again with VMS superglue. I reckon that these duct boards were probably painted in the base colour of the vehicle. But for visual interest, I'm leaving them wood. They just look too cool this way. Aha, now it's time for the problem I had with the glazing. As you would, the masks were removed from the model very carefully. I didn't want to scratch that nice glasswork. And eventually, after some gentle peeling, the masks were gone. As you can see here, there was a residue left behind, and this is really odd. I haven't had this happen before. And alcohol and lowered thinner didn't work. They'd usually take off an adhesive residue fairly easily. So I came to the conclusion that it had absorbed into the plastic. So I needed to buff the glass clear. For this I used some T-Cut, the regular car polishing compound. It took a few applications and a bit of work, but I did manage to polish the windows smooth. The T-Cut was applied, slightly thinned with water, left to dry, and then buffed away with a cotton bud. Any excess was then washed away with water and a soft brush. But as you can see, it did require some elbow grease, and I had to be careful not to damage the parts. This step seems a bit counterintuitive because I wanted a dusty windscreen. Yes, you heard it right. I always admire the models that have got a dusty windscreen with the little clean section carved out by the window wipers. Always looks really cool, so I wanted to try it. I didn't trust myself to reliably cut some neat masks for the effect, so I had to come up with a solution. And luckily, I had a set of 148 Montex masks for a Hurricane. The blue section on the RAF roundels were exactly the right size, so I cut these into 90-degree segments, using the Mark I eyeball as a measuring guide. These were then stuck in place on the windscreens, being careful to make sure it lined up nicely. There we go. Next up, I used some Tamiya lacquer paint deck tan, heavily thinned with mister leveling thinner. I gave this 1 or 2 very light mists, heavier at the bottom and lighter at the top. That should just be enough to give us the effect we want. Again, the masks were carefully removed. And annoyingly, once again, there was a slight residue left over, and it didn't want to come off with regular methods, so I had to buff it away again, but this time even more carefully. Next up, I used an AK chrome marker to paint the backing of the headlights. These are quite sheltered, so I wasn't too bothered how they were going to come out, as long as they were neat and tidy. And the AK chrome marker worked nicely. Next up, I painted the propeller with Mr. Colour Super Metallic Gold. In reality, the propeller was probably Panzer Grey, but for visual interest, I painted it in a goldy colour, to represent brass. I then glued on a few items like the windshield, the steering wheel, the propeller, and I had to come up with a method to glue the headlights into place. I didn't trust myself with a thick glue in such a fine area, so I dipped them in the Alclad Aqua Gloss and used that as the adhesive. I made sure only to get adhesive on the inside faces, and it worked okay. Lastly, the window wipers were glued in place carefully with a tiny touch of super glue. And here you can clearly see the dusty effect on the windshield. I think it looks really cool. So with the painting and the final details done, what does that leave us with? The weathering. This started with a contrast wash to make the details pop. For this I used Abteilung 502 Sepia mixed with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. I painted this over all the details and around all the crevices, just to make them pop and define them before we moved on to further weathering. This is where the model will really start to come to life. It's so satisfying to see the wash wick around all the details. With the wash done, it's time to move on to some streaking effects. For the first streaks, I'm going to be using Abteilung 502 Starship Filth. This was brushed on areas that I wanted to be streaky, and because this was an amphibious vehicle, I thought there might be more than usual. And after a few minutes, when any thinner had evaporated, I used a soft brush and dragged the paint in a downward motion to start the streaks streaking. Don't worry if you remove too much paint, because you can just start the process again. And also, don't press too hard with the brush. You want the bristles to move the paint and not remove it. Next up, I added some shadows, just lightly. I used the same colour, Abteilung 502 Starship Filth. I painted this in any creases, around the bumpers, under the lip around the rear of the vehicle. Just a sweep of paint and a little bit of blending, and we've got some artificial shadows. Next up, the nerve-wracking part for any build, adding some mud. I wanted to keep this restrained and focused on the underside and the wheel arches. Firstly, I brushed on a layer of AK Dust and Dirt Deposits Brown Earth. This is going to act as a glue and a homogenizing tone for our pigments. Next up, some pigments were stippled onto the wet paint. I used VMS pigments, EU Dark Earth, which is a nice rich dark tone, and EU Brown Earth, which is a nice rich mid-brown tone. I used a lot more EU Dark Earth than I used EU Brown Earth. I wanted the mud to have an overall darker appearance, and hints of remaining moisture. I didn't want it to be wet, but I didn't want it to look fully dry. This is quite a messy stage, so I did it in the lid of the model box. I always make the mistake of getting pigment all over my workbench. Not this time, pigments. Any excess was removed with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. But as I was quite careful, there wasn't a lot of overspill to remove. The same mix was heavily thinned and then painted on the tyres, firstly as a wash to show accumulation in the tyre treads and all the crevices. I then painted some carefully around the inner rim of the wheel. I'll be adjusting this later when it's dried to make it look more realistic. And after a few minutes when the thinner had started to evaporate, I used my favourite old tatty brush and brushed the mud effects towards the centre of the wheel to emulate a light centrifugal force. I then added some more mucky bits near the centre of the tyre, and once these were blended in, the wheels were complete. To fix the wheels to the body, I used VMS Flexi 5K Superglue for photo etch. I just like the consistency of that one. Along with the black and the black extra thin, it's one of my favourites. Next up, I added some splashes with Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown heavily thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. This was speckled over the entire lower areas of the model. You can see here how all these weathering layers are starting to blend together and build up some interest, depth and texture. I added some darker patches behind the wheels for some more wet sections. Not loads though, like I said earlier, I didn't want this to look too wet, despite it being an amphibian. Next up, I added some rust effects, starting with the exhaust, which was sponge chipped with some Vallejo grey blue. The blue undertones will add a nice interesting contrast to the orange. The first orange layer was done with Abteilung 502 Oxide Patina. Again, this is a paint being used as a glue for some pigment, so precision wasn't the aim of the game. Next up, I used some various Humbrol pigments. I used light rust, a dark rust, a black and a soot, not shown here. For some reason I only filmed one application, but you get the idea. Next up, I wanted to show some rust that had spilled out of the bilge pump. This hole here is the exit for the bilge pump, where excess water would have been pumped out of the vehicle, so I thought it may lend itself to some rusty effects. For the first streak, I used Abteilung 502 Oxide Patina, a slightly darker colour. This was then blended heavily, to emulate old staining. Careful streaks of the brush, feathering it out the further down we went. It took a little bit of work and back and forth to get this stain just right. To show some fresher rust, I used Abteilung 502 Light Rust and made a more concentrated streak in the middle of the old streaks. This was finished off by applying a dirty grimy wash around the outlet pipe. To add some more visual interest to the rear deck, I used some rope from Ropes in Scale out of Canada. This was carefully coiled up and then painted with VMS matte varnish to kind of glue it into place. And when this was dry, I gave it a light wash of Starship filth. On the driver's side window, I decided to wipe away a section as if the driver had cleaned a section of glass so he could see better. I initially wasn't going to do this on the passenger side, but I thought it looked a bit weird, so I scraped in some fingerprint marks and swirly cleany marks with a cut down toothpick. It takes a little work to remove the paint, but the result looks pretty good. Eventually. The propeller is quite a prominent feature on the rear of the model, so I wanted it to stand out a bit more. I decided to add some patina using a mix of blue, field grey and buff oil paints. I don't know if this is realistic, but I think it looks cool. And in my book, sometimes that's all that matters. I brushed on the verdigris shade with a fine paintbrush, and then used the same brush to blend it in. Very carefully. I didn't want to blend it completely, so I used slight tapping motions, just to feather some of the edges. And with that, my build of the Das Werk Schwimmwagen Trippel in 1/35 scale was complete. As ever, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons. I really appreciate the support you show to the channel. It's much appreciated, thank you. If you're interested in becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/LPJ Models. You get build updates and early access videos, and you get the warm fuzzy feeling of having supported the channel. So how do you think I did on this build? To be honest, I'm really pleased with it. Despite some of the shenanigans with the upper lower seam and the windscreen, it came out really nice. It's a really unique vehicle, and I think the paint job sets it off nicely. It's got some cool details, lots of nice little features, and I kinda want to own a real one. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I pick the right paint scheme? Did I add enough mud? I don't know, let me know. And also, I'm getting really close to 50,000 subscribers, so if you haven't subscribed already, I'd really appreciate it if you did. I don't usually ask, but just hit that button. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. I'll leave you with the gallery images. Thank you for watching.